This is a Dancing Stickman production.
Imagination is the most powerful force in the universe, right? Because you can't do things that you can't imagine. And then if you start being able to imagine, say, a better world, then you can start taking action to make a better world.
Welcome back to Worldsbuilder. Today I am speaking with game designer, writer, and gem of the human being, Quinn Murphy. Quinn is actually the second person I interviewed. This interview is from February 2025. But we had a great conversation about his business, Thoughtcrime Games, and the way that tabletop role-playing games are a vehicle for shaping our imaginations and the world around us. Quinn was actually the first person after Jacob to help with Broken Sky. The very first meeting Jacob and I had, we planted Easter eggs on our Blue Sky accounts, and Quinn helped me share mine out to a wider audience. He was the inspiration for the Lorekeeper character in Broken Sky because of his prolific ability to make micro TTRPGs. So sorry I missed Black History Month. I probably should have published this then, but celebrate Black people every month. Here's my interview with Quinn Murphy. Quinn, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
This podcast is broadly about the business of creativity, how to make art and make a living. So I do think our conversation might get more into the speculative, imaginative realm. So I want to start with some basic questions first. You've got a lot of games at Thoughtcrime Games. And I know you've written for Paizo, you've written for Wizards of the Coast, you've written for Kobold Press. I was just reading something you wrote for the Fate SRD yesterday, which is my favorite system. I love Fate.
Yeah, Fate is great.
So I'm just kind of wondering, can you sort of just trace your career path for us? Yeah, what was the last normie job you had?
I still doing normie stuff, right? Like that sort of helps finance a lot of this stuff, but I do sort of computer stuff by day and have for the last gazillion years, 20 years or so. But then in terms of RPGs, getting involved in that, I've been playing them for 30 something years. And it all actually started with 4th edition D&D. I'd been out of role-playing doing it for a while. And then I stopped in a place and I hadn't really heard anything about a new edition of D&D. And I was like, ooh, and I really liked the way they were going with it. People talked about the anime vibe and stuff, but I like anime, so it appealed to me. And then I was like, oh, let me check this out. And then I started really just because I was interested, I just started writing a blog on it. I made a blog called At Will. I get really into homebrew mechanics and stuff like that and making my own house rules. And like if I see something, I instantly want to kind of do my own thing with it. And then got some interest in some of the things I was doing with that, actually specifically for skill challenges, because I had my own take on it rather than the book's take. And then it just that started getting popular. And then I had some folks reach out to me for work. That's actually when I started actually getting paid for doing design. And then from there, I got sort of labeled as the 4E guy, but I like all role-playing games. I've done over the years just, everything from Fate to, small indie ones. Shout outs to Misspent Youth. I've done stuff for them, for that game, or New Orlandia, a whole range. And through the years, I got paid for stuff, but it was very hard to sort of connect. My creative process was very kind of slow and painful, and it was mixed up with, for many years, an undiagnosed ADHD. So it was hard to connect it steadily there. So I'd kind of be working, sometimes I'd be overwhelmed and couldn't do more. Other times I'd be sort of caught in the emotional storm of it. I've quit, in quotes, a few times. But ultimately, I realized that I love making games and I love playing role-playing games. I just think I think they are the greatest form of entertainment humans have ever made. I will give a full-throated defense of that. And actually, it was really helpful, getting back into it. I saw that they made a new edition of Pathfinder, and Logan Bonner, who's a friend of mine, was lead on it. And so I was just oh, let me check out what Logan's up to, right? And see what he made. And I read it, and I was actually blown away. Pathfinder's not going to be for everyone because of what it's oriented on, in terms of combat and things like that. But it was, at the time, and really still for a game of its size, its representation blew me away. I was very surprised. I'd never seen this in a D&D or other book before. And then I really liked the system. And then, I was able to start writing, doing some freelancing for them. And then that got me kind of back. This is after a period of quote unquote quitting, and it got me back in it. And then since then, I've been doing some freelancing. And then over this last year or two, I still freelance for them in other places. But then also I have these games of my own that I want to make. And I started Thoughtcrime Games has been a thing sort of for a while, but I never really took it seriously as a business. And then I started taking it seriously as a business over the last year and just working on my process and just kind of accelerating and making games.
That's dope. So how do you balance your tech job, your computer job with this? Like, how much of this is something that is sustainable for you, and how much do you have to lean on jobs that just make more money?
For my current situation, I definitely lean on my tech job, right? And that gets like a good chunk of my time. But then on the other end, it pays well enough that it lets me do some things that I couldn't otherwise sort of do. Like I have part-time, I have someone who helps me out scheduling things. Like I had to sort of bite the bullet and kind of admit to myself that there are tasks that I am rubbish at. Again, with my ADHD, realizing like, hey, things that I'm not motivated to do become really hard to do that. Like I can do them, but it usually takes so much energy to do. And I have like limited time to do something with that energy every day after I work and pay bills and stuff. So actually use some of that money, which it meant sort of cutting out some other luxury things I do, other fun stuff, but that it's helped me by having an assistant doing the things that I can't, or I don't want to do, and therefore probably won't do until it's like too late, has helped me tremendously.
I corresponded with her to arrange this, and I was like, man, I bet that's so helpful.
It is super helpful.
So I've been reading the Imagination is for Everyone blog, and you and I we like fundamentally agree on the role and importance of imagination in the exercise of power, and also on the value of TTRPGs as a way to express collective imagination. And that's why I'm psyched to talk to you, but I'm wondering if you could please explain the Imagination is for Everyone ethos for the audience.
Sure. Imagination for Everyone is kind of like a thing I've just been saying for many years now. The story behind it is like I remember growing up, and I was always around where I grew up, the weird kid who liked those games with the funny dice. And it was always like strange to me because it was like people couldn't wrap their heads around that I could do it. That it was like somehow that there was this game of like imagination and stuff, and that I wasn't supposed to have access to that because I was Black, right? And then I'd look around, and that there's like all of these things that sort of who was able to sort of imagine things sort of gatekeeped, around that, and then it makes sense given sort of American history why we're talking about Black people were like not allowed to read. They were kept from these things because imagination is the most powerful force in the universe, right? Because you can't do things that you can't imagine. And then if you start being able to imagine, say, a better world, then you can start taking action to make a better world. I'm just a obstinate, persistent person. So like when I was younger, I just did it out of spite. But as I got older, it's like I realized it's like this is using like imagination as sort of praxis, like using TTRPGs as praxis and practice of the act of imagining and this sort of empathy kind of engine, right? Like imagining yourself as other people in other situations is like just a really powerful tool that is for everyone, right? And one of the things over the years that I've tried to do is help people by selecting topics that might be atypical, that you wouldn't think would be subject for a role-playing game. Like I have a game, Five Fires, that's a 80s hip-hop RPG. Just trying to break down that limit of, oh, I can't play that game because, like, well, what's the because? Like, why can't you imagine, and like, why can't you just pretend for a bit?
TTRPGs are still pretty niche as a pastime. And so I have a really hard time getting my friends to play with me. Even I work in a creative industry, I have creative friends, and I still have a really hard time getting them to play these games with me because they do require things that you've mentioned in your blog, like time, creative energy, interest, and confidence. When you think about the TTRPG space, like I think about Gary Gygax and his problems and the way that D&D is still the most popular TTRPG in the market. And I think about how I didn't even get into them until I was in my 30s because the space never felt particularly accessible or welcoming to me. So, yeah, imagination is for everyone, but how do we get them to know that? Like, how do we draw people into this hobby who either don't think of themselves as creative or don't feel like they have the time for creativity? Because that's actually who I think needs it the most. Those are the people who, with their own imaginations, it's been like suppressed for so long that they're having a hard time even accessing it for themselves. We live in a society that I think is kind of arranged to just sort of like shove our faces into the dirt all the time. And I feel like TTRPGs really can help pull us out of that. And the way the space was built with kind of like high barriers to entry, how do we get people to come along with us and play these games?
That's a good question. And it's one I find myself, when I'm making games, I think about a lot. First, I think it is topics. Like, can you make role-playing games that are about things that are not necessarily kind of like these niche nerd topics? And it's not that there's anything wrong with them, but what if you made games that sort of appeal to a broader kind of scope of things, right? That was like one of my reasons I did Five Fires, because, a lot of times when people sort of do hip hop adjacent things in the RPG space, is more sort of focused on, say, like the mythology of sort of like what if we took like Wu-Tang's mythology and like made it real, which is cool, but like, for Five Fires, I was like, hey, what if we like made it about real people and how they turn stress into art, which then sometimes creates a way out of their situation, right? And takes a sort of different view of it. And that saying that it all exists on a continuum, right? But if, so a lot of times when I pitch that one, I go, hey, it's Beat Street, the game. And if you know Beat Street and you love Beat Street like I do, then you're like, ooh, sign me up. That sounds cool. Let me try that. And then I think some of it is the entryway, right, is making things that are easier to sort of enter. One of the reasons I like to make sort of smaller games and like micro RPGs is they force you into a sort of compression and immediacy. And you can make larger games out of them. But once you have that sort of way of like, hey, we're going to do this thing and it's going to take about 2 seconds for me to explain it to you, and then we're going to start playing, that's a really powerful tool and mechanism to get people into that first play experience. And especially if you have your friends, if you're the guide and you're just like, hey, give me like, instead of the typical 2 to 3 hours things, want to take like 30 minutes here and like, let's do like a thing real quick. And then if you can give people tight, fun half hour, then you can get them to commit to more, or if they only have time for the half hour, that's good. And you could just do it in that half hour chunk. It's taking away that time commitment too.
The first game that I really got into was Edragor, which was designed in the Fate system. But then I had to learn the Fate system in addition to like being very interested in the lore that was written for it. I was like, wait, but I don't actually understand how the system functions. So that actually took me time. Because also I didn't see any actual plays. So it was like, definitely I have to go through the book to be able to understand this. But the same thing happened with me learning the rules of Dungeons and Dragons. It was just watching actual plays because it's very complex. So having something that you can just boot up really quickly and be like, hey, this is going to be a fast game. I feel like a lot of people don't even realize that TTRPGs can be fast, that you can play them real quickly. I think that's great. So, okay, another thing that was occurring to me when you were talking about imagination is for everyone is I have this, it's not even a question. I have a statement and I just kind of want to get your thoughts on it. And it's the role of TTRPGs in community building regarding activism and our current trend of ascendant fascism. Because I feel like they can play a role in that space that I think is kind of untapped. Because when most people are thinking about community building, they're thinking in a direct activism way, but the engagement with radical imagination, I feel like there's still kind of a disconnect. And I'm wondering, like, because I've seen you posting about what's going on in our current dumpster fire. And so I'm wondering how you feel like TTRPGs can sort of like intersect with what's going on in the larger political climate right now.
I think there's two main kind of ways. One is just the act of expression. I was talking with some folks just the other day, and I posed then, and I'll pose now, that I think that we talk about sort of like sustenance of like air, food, water there. But a thing I don't think that we think of as much as like a vital sort of human sustenance need is expression, right? That there is a reason why we could go all the way back to like cave people, and we can find them doing paintings on the walls. Like if all they needed, like they'd, once they'd hunted and they had these long days, it was hard to sustain yourself, right? And after the end of all that, they're like, hey, what if I drew this thing, right? And memorialize my day, just some need to expression. Why did we make our tools ornamental, right? It's that need to express there, and just having an outlet to express yourself as something near to yourself or far from yourself, but just to have that expression and that way to connect to others, I think is vital. It feels frivolous, but it is not frivolous. It is actually vital, because the fascist forces in play would love nothing more for you to feel that art is pointless, games are silly. Why have any joy? Just go and plug yourself up to our AI thing and get a bunch of answers and work a bunch of hours. That's literally their joyless hustle culture, says just those things, right? And those people really don't utilize their imaginations or express themselves like well at all.
With this whole situation right now, what's happening is horrifying, but it's also really boring. We know exactly what playbook they're using. We know what moves they're going to make. This is the same moves they make over and over again. They don't try anything new. And I honestly believe we deserve a better class of villain, Like we imagine better villains than we have in real life.
It's true. I mean, honestly, if somebody came to my writer's room and been like, "Your villain is Doge," I would kick them out so fast.
You're not trying hard enough.
Yeah, imagine better. And but then it's also too. But their power is just the low barrier and consistency of boring, right? Like just unplug, right? Like just all you need to do is like work harder,
shut your brain off,
and like take a numbing agent. And here's your list of numbing entertainments. Watch other people do things, right? Like I watch other people play sports, right? Nothing against sports, but while you have your beer and do this other stuff. Definitely don't get in others with community and express yourselves in playing games and like think about different worlds, right?
Yeah.
And even when those fascist types get into role playing, it is the most boring paint by number. It's just like, hey, let's just like kill the other.
It's war games
Repeatedly, right? Like, okay, that sounds like so much fun. So then the second thing is like really just like the catharsis of it. Like I think is being able to, when you're in that space and you're able to engage. I find in my games these days, sometimes we're playing and we're just like, I'll check in with folks and be like, hey, it's been a crazy news cycle day. Like, are we like completely like unplugging from that? And they're like, yes. And they're like, cool. Like, so we anything that would sort of link or connect to current events, we just sort of move away from, right? And then other times we're feeling kind of froggy. And then we're just like, oh, well, like, this guy's, this person's acting just like this folk, right? And we sort of can engage in, and then that is going to be the person who's getting punched in the face today. So this should feel fun, right?
Yeah. And
we can sort of selectively use that to like get out our frustrations or just get away.
I love that. I think I'm going to start taking a peek at some of your micro TTRPGs because I desperately want my friends to start playing these with me.
I'm going to be actually putting them together and releasing them. The Wildfire trilogy, there will be an actual play on
Okay,
this.
cool.
Or actually, by the time this comes out, the actual play will be there. It is the story of how magic becomes sentient and free and then leaves and then comes back in a new form. And it is... out of all the micro RPGs, like when we play this one, I'm always just like amazed at like the stories that get told.
That's cool. Actually, what you were just saying about like the way that the structure of the society we live in asks us to like numb ourselves. I appreciated your breakdown of TTRPGs in the way that they're a very unique medium where if you're playing, you are creating a fiction and you're spectating that fiction simultaneously.
Right.
So it's like the only artistic medium that we have that completely bridges the gap between creative and audience at the same time. But I am somebody who works in a different creative field, and I've made so much content in order to just pay the bill. So I wind up thinking about the relationship between creative and audience a lot because it's, in terms of it being a professional exchange, it's extremely lopsided. In one of your other blog posts, you referred to AI-generated content as slop, and agreed. But I would say that I have made a lot of slop myself. Like I have made so many social media vertical videos for brands. I call it vomiting into the content hole. It's just low effort, like just churn them out, get them done as fast as you can. And that is what people will pay me to make. Now, I'm also simultaneously working on Oops All Witches, which is like a genuinely creative work. And it is work. Art, making art is labor, point blank, period. And like Oops All Witches is requiring me to use every professional skill I've picked up in the last 10 years. So everything from like project management and public speaking to sound design and post-production marketing. But the only reason I can do that is because I've spent a decade making bucketfuls of slop. And the reason they're willing to pay me to make that is because that's what the audience demands and engages with.
Well, that's what the audience knows.
It is what they know, but stuff that they don't know gets put in front of them and they don't engage with it. They do want the kind of the low grade entertainment that's cheap and easy to access, and they don't want to pay for it, and companies don't want to pay people to make it. And so I really see a need for audiences to actually start evaluating their role in the exchange between them and creatives. As an individual, you kind of want to interrogate your consumption behavior, like question what it is you are being fed and why it is you are engaging with it. And then we need to ask more broadly, like why it is that we live in a society where we are willing to pay people to make trash, but not to make actual art. So I guess I'm wondering where in that conversation that sort of needs to be opened up with people as audience, where TTRPGs can like fit into that.
Well, first part on the slop that people are sort of accepting is there is this for a lot of folks that, like if it's not their main thing, they just kind of know what they've been exposed to. And then they're only accepting sort of like novelty after something else is sort of broken through. And then there's a whole kind of list of like me too, like innovation comes kind of in a weird, slow roundabout way in that. And I guess if you look at like TTRPGs, I think it's kind of similar, is that something kind of breaks through fairly clearly, and then you have sort of taste makers and those folks kind of being like, ooh, this is like the theme, and they tune in, and then people eventually start to tune in after it. So these things are not slop, but just showing how the sort of trends go through. But like say like Apocalypse World. Apocalypse World is amazing. It's one of those important games, I think, of sort of modern TTRPG history. And then you see a lot of people make, Powered by the Apocalypse games, right? And then that's like becomes this sort of language. And I guess that's sort of like where we're going is like you have these things that people are willing to accept in their languages, but then it's hard to get them to sort of shift off languages, right? And then there's Blades, and there are all these other great themes. And part of the problem is in a certain space, these are all you hear about. The like systems based off that. But the truth is none of those things, maybe even added up, compares to the mind share that D&D has. Anytime I see something that kind of pits D&D against this system or that system or like these other things, it's like there's not any, in terms of market and mind share, there's no competition. They are literally two different spaces. When I think about sort of like the slop and these sort of trends and stuff, I find myself wanting to solve the problem by not having the problem. When I make games, I don't ever think about how am I going to sell this to a person who only knows 5e, right? Not that there's anything wrong with liking 5e, not that there is anything wrong with that person for playing the game, and not that there's anything wrong for them just wanting to stick with it. I think that gets sort of, people are like, play another RPG, and yes, that would be great, but what if we look at them as two different spaces, right? There is 5e, and then there is tabletop RPGs. And now you can be like, these are adjacent, but maybe they just don't see them as really related or for them. And they're always welcome. But like, what if I can, by not chasing after that, I can focus on making it accessible for people who actually have not touched anything, right? And so I guess that's the overall sort of slop thing. It was like, hey, there's people who accept all of this other stuff, but there's people who just might not be familiar or have any expectations whatsoever. And like, what could maybe catch those people?
I think my concern in there too, though, is that in terms of mindshare, like D&D, it occupies a space in collective imagination largely that like kind of overwhelms everybody's idea of what a TTRPG is. It's this like dungeon crawler designed by this very specific guy, and you play as murder hobos, and that is what people think of. So even when you're trying to reach people who aren't in the space at all, they probably do know what D&D is, even if they don't know specifically. So I guess it's sort of like, how do we break through a monoculture? That's a big question. But yeah, how do you break through a monoculture to get people to notice that there's other stuff going on?
I think of it as sort of an interesting thing about RPGs is they are games of borrowed fidelity, is that anything that goes into an RPG is actually sort of pulled from elsewhere else because you're basically your mind is the console, right? And so if your mind's a console, then it means like the things that work best are things that reference things that you've seen or experienced. We could be playing a game and I could go, hey, a guy in a black mask and a black helmet walks in with a laser sword, right? Which will give you a certain image. And if I go, Darth Vader walks into the room, that's a very specific image that I've just borrowed. The sum of it is D&D is its own kind of, at this point, its own set of collected, borrowed imagery and stuff that a lot of games take from it to do that. But I think because of the great thing with the borrowed fidelity nature of RPGs is that there's no limit to what you can borrow from. I think it's borrowing from different spaces to force people to look at it differently, right? If you were to borrow, like if you were to make a game about Basquiat, this is actually a game that's on my to-do list, actually, and that features his art and stuff like that. That's like a game, potentially, one you could, once you sort out the licensing and all that stuff, you could put that in the Met, right? And like the gift shop. And then be like, here's a thing where it's like, and using a TTRPG as a way to engage imaginatively with the story and narrative behind artwork, right? That's just like a completely different thing that like has nothing to do with, say, 5e, right? Like, or D&D at all. And if you see it, and especially if you see it in a new context, that I think that's the other part, is putting them in other contexts, right? Is how do I make something that I can actually put in a art gallery? Like you like this artist's paintings, like here's like a game conversation exercise that you can play to sort of like interact with the themes of their work. Things like that, I think, allow you to sort of get new spaces, new audiences, new ways of looking at it. It's actually something I've detailed, something that I'm actually working on right now, but that's sort of I'll let you know how that works out in a few months.
Yeah. What I think I like a lot about TTRPGs too is like when you are borrowing context for yourself while you're playing the game, in other media, you get called out for it. If it's very obvious that you have some kind of influence that you have borrowed to create a story of your own, people treat that like it's cheap, like you're copying, that sort of thing, which is always weird to me because all art is, you take in something from somebody else, you synthesize it into something of your own. But I feel like TTRPGs occupy a nice space where it's kind of actually expected that you do that because you do have to exercise your own imagination with a sense of immediacy because you're telling the story right now. So it's like, what's the fastest reference that I can do that like these people will understand? And so then it's okay. I like that a lot.
Yeah, because it's like that borrow fidelity is useful because conversation as a medium for playing a game is actually very slow, right? And so if I'm forced to not use any touchstones and describe it all from scratch, then we don't it's going to be very hard to get something, and it's going to be very hard to get the impact. But if I can, is why art is important in RPGs. Like art is like an actual critical part. Especially if you're doing something with no touchstones, right? Like then you require some art to sort of help people latch onto it and know what's going on, right?
Yeah. I actually just got a rough from the person who's doing the poster for Oops All Witches, and I'm like, I'm really glad to have this because 3 big landmarks are like in the poster, and I'm like, great, because I don't know if I did a very good job describing them verbally when we played the game. Okay, so I'm gonna shift us back into sort of like the work, and I would ask you, what do you recommend as like an entry point for people who want to be producing more of their own creative work, but also need it to be something where they can sustain themselves still while they're doing that? Like, how do you recommend people just sort of shift away from the normie jobs and into a creative field in a way where they can actually build this up as something that is sustainable to do in their lives?
The most powerful thing I've learned, and it's going to sound weird, is to start with forgiveness. Don't make any change in your life without first pre-forgiving yourself for the times you're gonna mess up, you're gonna fail, you're gonna not do what you meant to do, and you're gonna get too busy sometimes, you're gonna run out of energy. All of that is fine, and like forgive yourself ahead of time. It might make it much easier to iterate and learn. then after that, after you got forgiveness locked in, for me, it's starting small. When I decided I was going to take Thoughtcrime seriously, the first thing I did was I started with a lot of micro RPGs. Like I'm going to make like small little things. I started with a microfiction jam, which was 250 characters
Wow.
games. And that was actually where these games that I'm actually now doing full versions of, the Wildfire trilogy was born. And, start with small bits of work and see if you can sort of build up on those. If you have a lot of ideas, then try and just sort of like build and sort of capture and make small things to touch on them. Or if you tend to just have like one idea that goes deep, make small chunks of the idea. Don't try and build like I need to catalog like all 100 cities in this, like don't do that, right? Pick a region and go like, I'm going to detail this out. And then I think the other part is release things, is find some way to get it out there and do some editing. Like honestly, to get started, for me, I would just kind of release stuff. I wouldn't even edit it. I don't necessarily suggest that, but to just like way back in the day, just getting going when I was starting the blog and the other stuff, I would just write stuff and like release it there just to get that feeling of getting things going. I do edit and stuff now, but I do try to be releasing things pretty, even if they're just small things, get those out and into the world, because that shipping things is really important.
What's interesting is you said release things, and then I slowly caught up to what you were actually saying. But honestly, the first thing I thought of was just how you also have to, when you are deciding to release something, that you also do have to like let it go. It's the whole perfect is the enemy of the good thing. Like at a certain point, it's not going to be exactly what you had in your head, but close enough means it is good enough to put out there.
I think just the last thing I would say is actually two things tied together. Realize that you don't have any choice on things that people respond to. I've had things where it's like I poured my heart into it and be like, man, I can't wait till people see this, and crickets, and things that I literally just shout off the top of my head that people are like, this, right? And it's all good. It's not, there's no lessons in that other than you release and you let the world pick what they want off the menu. And then also being comfortable. There's going to be a period, and there will be periods, and there will definitely be a period when you're just starting off where no one cares about your work. It's much you think the problem is going to be that people are going to hate your work, but if they hate your work, that means like they care about your work, all right? And that is much easier to deal with no one caring or responding to your work, but you have to deal with that. That's the river to cross.
Yes, because at least if somebody hates your work, that means they've engaged with it.
Yeah, I have this weird thing sometimes when I release stuff. Like when I find my first hater on it,
yes,
I'm like, yes, I've arrived. Like I'm like, yes,
I win.
We're here. Yeah, I'm like, it's good because it's like if I have somebody who hates it, that means I have somebody. There's potential for someone to love.
It means they read through the rules and said, I have an opinion about this. And they have their own opinion. Somebody else can do the same in the opposite direction. So I'm wondering too, kind of along the same lines, I'm wondering if you have ever been thinking about like different and imagining new structures and pathways to make this kind of work a more feasible career. Like, these are really good practical recommendations for like the world we currently exist in. But like, I think a lot about how the studio model in Hollywood is awful and dying, and that there need to be replacements for it. And I'm looking at what I see around me and like what I think has potential to like build new and more collaborative opportunities for work in media, filmmaking, that sort of thing. And I'm wondering if you are thinking about anything along similar lines in game design.
Yes. Touching back on that sort of fine art RPG. I collect a lot of art. I love art. And it's a thing I've been thinking of, like, how do we get tabletop RPGs out of game stores and into related places, right? There should be some sort of like role-playing game kind of things when I go to the MFA, right? Like, if they do a new exhibit, they could like easily do that because the interesting thing about TTRPGs, a lot of interesting things, but they're games of borrowed fidelity, which means that they are also the ideal fan fiction forum, which is why there was that trend of companies doing the RPGs, because they sort of tuned into this fact of like, hey, we can give you elements of our IP and then give you a method to play with them and sort of construct your own worlds. And that is really just fan fiction in a sense. And why can't we have fan fiction of artists, or why we can't have fan fiction of pick a thing? And it's just a matter of proving that case, making that connection, and crossing that barrier.
TTRPGs is Tumblr.
Yeah, I mean, really, I think once you break that barrier, you also start being able to break the barrier in terms of the expected time commitment. We were talking about that earlier, is like rather than expecting you're going to sit around and play this game for 2 or 3 hours, actually, like, what if this is like a thing that you could play with another person from 15 minutes?
Yeah, you could do it on your lunch break or something like that.
Right. And then once you've broken down the time, you can break down where you play it, right? Like, and all of these things become accessible, and not that we don't want games in game stores, that, we definitely want that as well. But if we can sort of branch out, we give more opportunities for people to, find their lane and find sort of a home and specialty.
Yeah, there's space in it where they feel comfortable, and they can settle themselves there and then expand from that space to other things. Thank you, Quinn Murphy, so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. This was great.